بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والحمد لله رب العالمين اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I'm becoming good friends with this camera here, staring into it every day, 3-4 times, talking. Today, inshallah, we will be talking about Surat Al-Hashr. It's the second surah and the 28th juz', which is the cluster that we're going to be talking about. From Qaf, basically, from that cluster, the previous one that we did, to Al-Nas is called the Mufassal, the detailed. And it's called the detailed because it's the opposite of that. It's everything is summarized. And Arabs do that quite often. They call something by its opposite. For different reasons that are linguistic, I don't want to get into right now, waste your time. But from Qaf to the end, it's called the Mufassal. And it's 4 clusters. Qaf to Hadid, and then Mujadala to Tahrim, then Al-Mulk to Al-Mursalat, and then Surah Al-Naba until the end. Just each juz' on its own. And at the end, inshallah, probably not this year, but next year, we'll try to kind of break down. They summarize the Quran, these 4 clusters. They basically, the Mufassal just summarize everything the Quran talked about in the first 26 juz', where everything took a long time, and everything is kind of summarized and compressed down in these surah. The juz' that we're in, the cluster that we're in from Mujadala to At-Tahrim, is a Madani juz'. Everything was revealed in Medina. So they're very dynamic surahs. They talk about relationships. They organize the relationships within the Muslim community. They organize the relationships of Muslims with other groups around them, living with them, or outside of where they live, those who are enemies, those who are allies. It organizes leadership. It organizes unity. It organizes dealing with people who don't necessarily fully agree with us in terms of working together. It organizes family relationships. It's just a lot of tanzeem, just a lot of organization and pointing out how things should happen within the new Muslim society. Because the Prophet ﷺ had created this new society. It was unheard of that people from such different backgrounds, whether it is lineage and heritage background differences or ethnic differences, all living together. And within the same society, you have people from different faiths and from different walks of life, different opinions, and everyone's abiding to this new constitution that has been signed into these new laws. It was a very fresh experience for Arabia at the time. So a lot of the Quran kind of addresses the challenges and the difficulties. It's really very important to understand these parts of the Quran and spend time contemplating them and reflecting upon them. Surah Al-Hashr will do something similar to what Surah Al-Mujadala did. Surah Al-Mujadala focused on the relationships amongst Muslims within the society, amongst Muslim individuals. Surah Al-Hashr is going to look at groups, organizing the relationships between Muslims and other Muslim groups and other Muslim groups rather than individuals. Rather than Surah Al-Mujadala looked at spouses, looked at people in their gatherings, looked at secret council, how to deal with your leader, how to deal with those who are related to you but don't follow your faith. It was individual relationships or being organized inside the community. Surah Al-Hashr looks at groups and how we deal with groups that betray us, how we deal with groups that are our allies, how do we deal with groups that are struggling or suffering within our society. How do you deal with groups that are similar to us? How do you deal with groups that aren't similar to us? And that's what Surah Al-Hashr does. The first paragraph in the surah talks about the incident of Jala' Bani Nadir. It was a group of Ahl Kitab, people of the book, who were living inside of Al-Madinah, who had signed the treaty with the Prophet ﷺ, signed the constitution, to live, to be citizens of this new country. And what happened is that they tried to kill the Prophet ﷺ. There was an attempt of assassination that was proven, that they were trying to kill the Prophet ﷺ. The ﷺ left their area that they were living in and offered them time to rectify the mistake, to admit that they made a mistake, to bring those who tried to kill him ﷺ to justice and to apologize, and they refused. They stood by their attempt of assassination, which basically was going against the constitution. And the surah talks about that at the beginning, and the fact that they were asked to move. They were removed from Medina. You can't live here anymore. You have to go live somewhere else. And they were removed, and they went and they lived in Khaybar. There was no war that occurred. There was no fighting. There was no battle. But they had to move. If you don't, and this was a lesson for the Muslims and a lesson for us today. If you're going to live in a society, you have to abide by the rules that everyone has agreed upon. If you're not going to live by those rules, you need to leave. You need to go live somewhere else. Wherever that may be, you come to this country, you have to live by the rules. If you don't like the rules, then there are channels that you can go through to talk about changing these rules if you think that they're unfair. But for as long as you're here, you live by those rules that we've all agreed upon. You can't break the rules and expect that you're going to be treated like everyone else and that things are going to work out for you. Banu Nadir broke the rule. They tried to kill the leader. They tried to kill the Prophet ﷺ. They didn't rectify the situation. They stood by it. هو الذي أخرج الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب من ديارهم لأول الحشر ما ظننتم أن يخرجوا. And the Muslims didn't think that they were going to be able to remove them because they've been there for such a long time. This tribe had lived in Medina for such a long time. How could you possibly remove them? وظنوا أنهم مانعتهم حصونهم من الله فأتاهم الله من حيث لم يحتسبوا وقذف في قلوبهم الرعب يخربون بيوتهم بأيديهم وأيدي المؤمنين فاعتبروا يا أولي الأبصار. And they thought the people of the of Bani Nadir, they thought that if they stayed in their castle, that they would be protected, that no one could remove them. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had them removed in a way they never thought of. Ru'b, just fear, filled their hearts. And when fear fills the hearts of a society, decisions aren't made properly, and there's no trust in leadership, and they gave up quicker than anyone who was observing this incident thought they would, because they could have stayed in their castles for years, not requiring any outside assistance. They had enough food and water there to live and to survive, not needing. And in the meantime, the whole issue could have been resolved, but they gave up. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَوْلَا أَن كَتَبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْجَلَاءَ لَعَذَّبَهُم فِي الدُّنْيَا. Had Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not told the Prophet ﷺ that they need to leave, then the alternative would have been war, to fight them. And that's not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, and that's not what the Muslims wanted. There's no interest in causing war. But if we can't agree to a number of rules that we all that serve the larger picture, to serve the actual society, then those who break the rules have to go find somewhere else to live. Or else it's impossible for there to be proper tolerance and for there to be proper citizenship. It's a very difficult concept, and it's maybe for many of us in this state that we're in, doesn't really matter to you. But I think it's important to understand that as Muslims, we come up with a set of common laws and rules that we agree with everyone upon, and we hold ourselves and everyone to those rules. And that's how societies become prosperous. So when we come and live in the country that we're living in, or any other country, you have to abide by the laws. You have to abide by those rules. If you don't like the rules, it doesn't mean it's okay. Not liking the rules doesn't mean it's okay not to abide by them. And I think that's the point that Islamic is very, very relevant, and it's worth looking into. The verses actually comment on something that I think is interesting. ما قطعتم من لينة أو تركتموها قائمة على أصولها فبإذن الله وليخزي الفاسقين. During the time that the Muslims performed the siege around Bani Nadir, forcing them to leave, the Muslims didn't have a lot of financially. They were always they struggled for most of the Prophet ﷺ's life, and they got very cold during the night. And it was haram to them to ever cut down a tree. And that's something that the Prophet ﷺ had taught them, and they lived by that. But they got so cold one night that they cut off branches from trees to use it as firewood to stay warm. And the next morning they felt they regretted that, and they felt very bad about it. And they started asking the Prophet ﷺ whether they were going to be punished for cutting down these trees. So the Quran came and said, "Ma qata'tum min linatin." Lina is it's the name of my daughter, but it's also a small nakhl. It's a small palm tree. A small palm tree is called lina. And they had cut one down to use for firewood. So the Quran came and said, if you do that, whether you do it or you don't, if you're doing it for your personal use, for your need, then فَبِإِذْنِ اللَّهِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has permitted you to do that. It just shows you the respect the Muslims had built in their hearts and minds towards nature and towards resources around them. You don't cut down trees unless you 100% have to. The second paragraph in the surah starts organizing the financial situation the financial system within the Muslim country. وَمَا أَفَاءَ اللَّهُ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ مِنْهُمْ فَمَا أَوْجَفْتُمْ عَلَيْهِ مِنْ خَيْرٍ وَلَا رِكَابٍ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يُسَلِّطُ رُسُلَهُ عَلَى مَنْ يَشَاءُ مَا أَفَاءَ اللَّهُ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ مِنْ أَهْلِ الْقُرَى فَلِلَّهِ وَلِلرَّسُولِ وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ. What is fate? Fate is whatever bounty or loot the country is able to obtain without war, without going to war. Traditionally in Arabia, if If fate was always distributed amongst the soldiers and the war commanders and the elders of the tribe. No one else had any say when it came to fate. And that's what and the Quran came and changed that, and the people didn't like it. By the way, there were a lot of people even amongst the Sahaba who objected to this. The fate meaning that no war occurred. And the Quran is saying that فَمَا أَوْجَفْتُمْ عَلَيْهِ مِنْ خَيْلٍ وَلَا رِكَابٍ. You didn't exhaust your horses, you didn't ride, you didn't fight. You got this bounty without any of that. So then this bounty that you have, this loot, is going to be distributed فَلِلَّهِ وَلِلرَّسُولِ وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى, meaning it's going to be given Allah and His Prophet to be used in the proper channel, which is ذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَابْنِ السَّبِيلِ. Give to your relatives, give to the needy, give to those who can't take care of themselves, give to those who are stranded and can't find their way home. Take care of the people of the lower economic group within your society. And then the ayah states a law, an Islamic law, that I think should be memorized by everybody. كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ. This is what the ayah says. You distribute that wealth to the poor, to those who are in need, so that money does not become Dula. Dula means exclusive, something that is exclusively circulated within a certain group. You don't want money and wealth to circulate exclusively amongst the rich only. You can't have an economic system that is rigged in a way where the poor will get poorer and the rich will get richer. That if the system is developed in a fashion where the rich take very little chance and the poor take a lot of chance all the time, then that's a system that is rigged to make the poor poorer and to make the rich richer, and that is a system that is completely un-Islamic. Islamic systems, regardless of what the definition of an Islamic economic system actually is, which is something that scholars have never agreed upon, and will take a long time, and today we need to produce something that is much more modernized in terms of how wealth and how assets and money and currency is going to be used in an Islamic system. But what we do know is that the system has to be designed in a way where the poor get richer and the rich can hold on to their wealth and get richer as well. But that has to be a part of the system. It can't be an exception. It can't be the poor get poorer, but we do have these external aids that help the poor. No, that's not an Islamic system. It has to be programmed within the system that the poor will get better, that the lower class will become middle class, and the middle class can move up to the higher class. That's how it's supposed to be programmed and work and designed. كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says. This is how He's basing His rulings and His decisions upon, subhanahu wa ta'ala. When He's saying the fate doesn't go just to the army and those, it goes to the poor. They didn't like it. That's why they didn't like it, to the point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had to add an ayah to this verse that is probably one of the most known verses in terms of following the Prophet. وَمَا آتَاكُمُ الرَّسُولُ فَخُذُوهُ وَمَا نَهَاكُمْ عَنْهُ فَانْتَهُوا. And what your Prophet tells you to do, you must do. When he tells you not to, you must not do. An additional incentive and encouragement that you need to listen. They didn't want to listen because that's not what they were used to. And that's a big change that occurred in Arabia when Islam brought this financial system that started to remove people from the lower socioeconomic status and lift them to middle class at least. The goal is not to make the rich poor, no, or to deprive them from increasing their wealth, but it has to be organized in a manner that will lead by default for people who have less wealth and have less assets and have less chances to have more of that. It has to be embedded in the system. It can't be an exception. It can't be based on external help. And no, I think that's something that's maybe beyond the scope of this little talk that we're doing tonight. فسورة الحشر هي السورة الثانية في محور السور الذي نحن بصدده من المجادلة إلى التحريم. والمفصل من قاف إلى الناس 4 محاور تلخص كل ما في القرآن. سميت مفصل، هذا من إطلاق العرب الشيء على ضده، فهي ليست مفصلة لكنها مختصرة، وقد تم وضع معلومات كثيرة جدا في سور قصيرة مقارنة بما قبلها، مقارنة البقرة مثلا بالحشر، فروقات كبيرة من ناحية عدد الآيات وعدد الكلمات. فهذه السور من القاف إلى الناس هي 4 محاور. تحدثنا عن المحور الأول فيها من القاف إلى الحديد، محور المقارنات والاختيارات. هذا المحور اللي نحن بصدده هو محور تنظيمي لحياة المسلمين في مجتمعاتهم، هو مدني بامتياز، وهو محور حركي تشعر فيه بالحياة، تشعر فيه كأنك ترى حياة النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام. كله قصص، كل سورة أتلوها عليك أذكر لك قصة حدثت معه عليه الصلاة والسلام ومع المسلمين، حتى نزلت الآيات وأصلت لمبدأ معين في التعايش وفي الحياة. فسورة المجادلة ونظمت حياة المسلمين فيما بينهم كأفراد، الرجل مع زوجته، الناس مع بعضهم في اجتماعاتهم، الناس في مجالسهم، مع القائد، مع الذين هم يعني لم يظهروا لك الولاء رغم أنهم يعني أقرباؤك، مع الذين رفضوا أن يكونوا أولياء لك. هذه العلاقات الفردية سورة الحشر تنظم علاقات الاجتماعية للمجموعات. فأول فقرة في السورة، أول بضع آيات تتحدث عن علاقة المسلمين مع بني النضير، وقعوا الوثيقة مع النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام، ثم حاولوا قتله وثبتت عليهم هذه المحاولة، ثم رفضوا الاعتراف ورفضوا الانصياع ورفضوا الاعتذار ورفضوا إصلاح القضية، فأصبح من الواجب إجلاؤهم، ليس حربهم إنما إجلاؤهم. لا يمكن لك أن تعيش في بلد أنت لا تتبع فيه الأنظمة والقوانين، يجب أن تنصاع للأنظمة والقوانين في أي بلد تحيا فيه. تأتي إلى هذه البلد تحيا عبر يعني وفق قوانينهم، لا تعجبك قوانينهم، إما أن تذهب عبر السبل التي وفروها لك لتغيير هذه القوانين، أو إما تترك البلد وتمشي. أما تحيا في البلد وتخالف القانون هذا مرفوض إسلاميا. فيعني ينتبه أحدنا يأتي هذه البلاد، يجب أن يعني يفهم القانون ويلتزم بالقانون. نظرت إلى القانون فوجدته يعني غير عادل، هناك أساليب لتغيير هذا القانون، الاعتراض عليه والتشكي منه. أما مخالفته لمجرد أنه لا يعجبك فهذا ليس من شيم المسلمين. وتم إجلاء بني النضير، وهذا من فضل الله عليهم، ولولا أن كتب الله عليهم الجلاء لعذبهم في الدنيا ولهم في الآخرة عذاب النار. قضية الآخرة هذه بينهم وبين الله. ثم الله سبحانه وتعالى في صدد هذه الآيات يقول: ما قطعتم من لينة أو تركتموها قائمة على أصولها فبإذن الله. كان المسلمون يتحرجون عن قطع النخل وعن قطع الأشجار، لكنهم لما حاصروا بني النضير بردوا وكانوا قليلي ذات اليد، ففي ليلة من الليالي قطعوا شجرة ليستخدموا حطبها في الدفء، ثم ندموا في اليوم القادم وظنوا أن العقوبة تنزل بهم، فذهبوا إلى رسول الله يعتذرون، فنزلت الآية تقول لهم: لا بأس عليكم ما دمتم استخدمتموها للضرورة. هذا يدلك على تعظيم المسلمين للطبيعة من حولهم وللموارد التي بين أيديهم، فلا تقطعوا الأشجار هكذا لا تشفيا من الناس ولا انتقاما منهم، لكن بنو النضير يخربون بيوتهم، ما خرجوا إلا وقد يعني هدموا بيوتهم وحرقوا أشجارهم حتى لا ينتفع بها غيرهم، ومع ذلك النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ما عاقبهم ولا حاربهم. القضية كانت التزام بالميثاق، يعني وهذا تعامل المسلمين كمجموعة مع الذين خانوا. ثم تأتي آيات تتحدث عن كيفية التعامل كمسلمين مع المال الذي يدخل هذا المجتمع المسلم. كان في القديم الفيء، وهو المال الذي يأخذه المسلمون دون حرب، يعني يذهبون فلا يحصل حرب ولا يحصل قتال، ويكون لهم هذا الغنيمة تحصل بالحرب، أما الفيء فبدون حرب. فكان المعهود أن الفيء كالغنيمة يوزع على يعني كبراء القوم وعلى الجنود والمحاربين والجيوش. فجاءت الآية تقول: ما أوجفتم عليه من خيل ولا ركاب، أنت لا تعبت في خيلك ولا في ركابك ولا حربت، فهذا المال لله وللرسول ولذي القربى واليتامى والمساكين وابن السبيل. فهذا ما أعجب يعني القوم، غضب الناس من هذا الحكم أن يؤخذ هذا المال ويرد على الفقراء. فقال سبحانه وتعالى: كي لا يكون دولة بين الأغنياء منكم. أي نظام اقتصادي إسلامي يجب أن يكون مهيئا لإخراج الفقير من فقره إلى الطبقة المتوسطة على الأقل. يجب أن يكون النظام مبرمجا هكذا، أي هو مهيئا لإخراج الناس، ليست قضية استثناء يعني أن هناك دائما مساعدات خارجية تأتي للفقراء فتعينهم. لا، يجب أن يكون النظام نفسه معدا لإخراج الفقراء من حالة الفقر. يعني النظام الذي يجعل الغني أغنى والفقير أفقر هذا ليس بإسلامي بغض النظر عن تفاصيله. النظام الإسلامي لا نعرف، الاقتصاد الإسلامي ليس عندنا الآن تفاصيل واضحة له لأن المتغيرات كثيرة، لكن الذي نعرفه أنه يجب أن يكون معدا بطريقة يتشارك فيها الفقير والغني الخسارة أو احتمال الخسارة. يجب أن يكون هناك تساو إلى حد معين في تحمل مخاطر البيع والشراء. ليس أن الفقير يتحمل كامل يعني احتمال الخسارة، والغني لا يحتمل احتمال لا يتحمل يعني احتمال الخسارة، فيزداد الغني غنى ويزداد الفقير فقرا. هذا إشكال عجيب عندنا الآن في العالم ككل، وهذا يجعل المال دولة بين الأغنياء. فمن أجل هذا اليوم المال يعني أغنى 1% من البشر يعني يملكون أكثر مما يملكه 90% من البشر في الكرة الأرضية. وهذه أرقام يعني ما اخترعتها، هذه أرقام مهولة وصادمة ومتعبة الحقيقة. You continue now in the verses, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts talking about another group of Muslims living amongst them. للفقراء المهاجرين الذين أخرجوا من ديارهم وأموالهم يبتغون فضلا ربهم ورضوانا وينصرون الله ورسوله. The poor, the needy within your society, they have to be taken care of. They have to be sought out and offered services, because these are people who are trying to improve themselves. There are people who are like you, that you share the same path with them. You can't be ahead and they're behind. You can't leave them behind. والذين تبوأوا الدار والإيمان من قبلهم يحبون من هاجر إليهم ولا يجدون في صدورهم حاجة مما أوتوا ويؤثرون على أنفسهم ولو كان بهم خصاصة ومن يوق شح نفسه فأولئك هم المفلحون. He gives an example of the Ansar who were living in Medina before the Muhajirin came. They loved the Muhajirin because they had they are your partners walking down the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they would give them selflessly, even though sometimes they were in need just like them, but they would divide it down right in the middle, to make sure that they were helping their brothers. وَمَنْ يُوقَ شُحَّ نَفْسِهِ, and the one that is capable of protecting himself from his own selfishness is the one who's going to find success. And that's what the verse says. This important relationship between the wealthy Muslims and the poor Muslims has to be a relationship of love, has to be a relationship of aid, of help. We try to remove our brothers and sisters who are in a state of need to a state where they're not in need. And we have to find that it's something that we enjoy, and we have to get rid of our selfishness so that we can do it, or else it's not going to happen. That's what these verses talk about. They move on and they give us an example of people living amongst us who don't necessarily believe with us. أَلَمْ تَرَ إِلَى الَّذِينَ نَافَقُوا يَقُولُونَ لِإِخْوَانِهِمُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ. Now it's as if we have like all these different parties within the Muslim society. There's the Muslims who are following Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's prophet, and then there's the munafiqeen. They're another party of people. We don't fight them. You're not at war with them, but they don't agree with you, and they make alliances with others. And the ayah is showing us how they were making allegiances towards the people of Bani Nadir, telling them, if you leave, we'll leave with you. If they fight you, we'll fight with you. They're lying, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying they're lying. They're too scared of you to do any of this. But it's showing us a dynamic, a conversation that is occurring between them. These are all types of people that exist in the Muslim society. And this surah is explaining to us that this is how it is. You need to stick together. You need to be as one in order for you to stand up against those who don't agree with you. It's almost never about fighting and war and combat. It's very rarely about that in the Quran. And actually, Surat Al-Hashr is one of the few surahs in the Quran that show that there's all these different groups that live in the same society. Do we remove the munafiqeen? No. We only remove those who broke the constitution, who threw the constitution away and tried to kill the leader. But the munafiqeen who are allies with them, they're not removed. As long as they're following what they had agreed to follow regarding the constitution itself, they're welcome to stay, even though they are saying things that أنتم أشد رهبة في صدورهم من الله ذلك بأنهم قوم لا يفقهون لا يقاتلونكم جميعا إلا في قرى محصنة أو من وراء جدر. They fear you more than they fear God, and they would never dare fight you unless they were in castles. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explained to the Muslims the truth of the matter, but the value of these verses is the fact that they are left to be. Muslims didn't declare war upon the munafiqeen, even though they were a group that existed in within Medina, within this larger Medina society that the Prophet ﷺ had created. تتابع آيات الحديث فتتحدث عن مجموعة أخرى من البشر الذين يعيشون في المدينة مع المسلمين وهم الفقراء. وتتحدث عن علاقة جميلة إنسانية بين الفقراء المسلمين وأغنيائهم، ومثال الأنصار الذين يؤثرون على أنفسهم ولو كان بهم خصاصة. يقول لنا سبحانه وتعالى الذي يوق شح نفسه والمفلح. هذا الذي يستطيع أن يتخلص من الأنانية فيعطي. العلاقة بين أغنياء المسلمين أو المقتدرين منهم والفقراء يجب أن تكون علاقة محبة، علاقة ود، علاقة عطاء، علاقة يهدف فيها المسلمون الأغنياء إلى رفع الفقراء من فقرهم إلى الحالة المتوسطة التي يستطيعون فيها إعالة أنفسهم. والله ما في مجتمع مسلم لا يعني ليس فيه ما يكفي من المال لإعالة الجميع، لكن هناك سوء تنظيم وسوء استخدام وقلة محبة وقلة ثقة، فيبقى من المسلمين من يعني يتخلفون عن الركب للفقر وللجوع وللحاجة، فلا يتعلم الأطفال بشكل جيد ولا ينشأ الناس نشأة صالحة فيها دين وأخلاق وقيم. والسبب هو يعني الشح يا أخواني، والسبب هو انعدام المحبة بين المسلمين. فهذه علاقة المسلمين مع الفقراء في بلادهم يجب أن تكون علاقة ود وعطاء يعني وإحسان. اقرأوا الآيات في سورة الحشر، والله جميل، للفقراء المهاجرين الذين أخرجوا من ديارهم، آيات جميلة. ثم تلفت الآيات نظرنا إلى وجود أحزاب وجماعات ضمن المجتمع المسلم في المدينة. حزب المنافقين والذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب، أحزاب موجودة لم يأمرهم ربهم سبحانه وتعالى أن يخرجوهم جميعا أبدا، ما أخرج إلا الذين خالفوا الدستور وحاولوا قتل النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام، الباقي يبقى. ألم تر إلى الذين نافقوا يقولون لإخوانهم الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب لئن أخرجتم لنخرجن معكم ولا نطيع فيكم أحدا أبدا وإن قتلتم لننصرنكم والله يشهد إنهم لكاذبون لئن أخرجوا لا يخرجون معهم ويرينا حديثهم وكلامهم كله كذب. يعني ليس هذا المهم، المهم أن هناك هذه الجماعات موجودة على الأرض يعني، وما دمت لم تخالف الدستور تبقى، حتى لو كنت يعني حتى لو كان فكرك مختلفا عن فكري وتوجهاتك مختلفا عن توجهاتي. هذه حقيقة المجتمع المدني في المدينة الذي أنشأه النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام، وأمر يستحق أن يعني ننظر فيه. The verse Surat Al-Hashr ends with some of the most powerful ayat in the Quran. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله ولتنظر نفس ما قدمت لغد واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. O those who believe, have piety when you deal with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and make sure that you plan long term for what you're going to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with. I love it because that's exactly what this verse, this surah needs. The relationships the Muslims have with non-Muslims, with traders, with allies, with their wealth, with the poor. This is an issue of long-term planning. We have to really take time to think, what do we want to see 10, 15 years from now? What types of relationships do we want the Muslim societies to have with other societies? What do we want to see regarding the low socioeconomic group of Muslims? What do we want them to be 10 years from now? It has to be a long-term plan, and that verse is right there to remind us of it. And then it says, لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله. If this Quran was descended upon a mountain, upon rock, then the rock would shake in fearfulness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, understanding the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How is it that it comes to our hearts and we fail to respond the same way our rock is responding? Have our hearts become harder than rock? Has our level of comprehension become so dulled down that rocks seem to understand more than we do? Again, in a surah that talks about equity, talks about the importance of taking care of the poor, talks about dealing with citizenship and citizens within the country you live in. Wallahi, very, very deep. The surah ends with Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illahu. Verses that tell us the beautiful names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reminding us of who He is subhanahu wa ta'ala. You're going to see that in this juz'. Every couple of surahs, you're going to find some verses that are extremely spiritual. Why? Because the surahs are so dynamic. Do this, don't do this problem, this, he said this, they said that. You have to deal with it like this. You get in the midst of life and you start forgetting your spirit, your soul. So the verses come in and they just give you this very concentrated dose of spirituality. At the end of Surat Al-Hashr is a really good example because the verses are very moving and beautiful. I hope that was beneficial. Subhanakallah wa bihamdika ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Jazakumullahu khairan wa barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.